First news came as whispers on the emergency bands, and in the break rooms where technicians drank stale coffee and watched the skylights. Shiver pilots said the new arrivals did not talk in the way others did. Miners said they sang through metal. And stone mariners said their ships moved like tide under Moonavarion. Used the same word when the shape of their fleet cut the clouds over the Western Ocean Farnate, because they fired on any 1-8. Because they made demands. Best when the female figures stepped down in pale veils and living armor. The air itself went still, and even the gulls on the pier folded their wings and went. Wyatt Clare was a field interpreter with a soft voice and steady hand. She had a habit of looking at people and seeing the small tired parts that wanted peace, had sat with miners after cave-ins, and with farmers after flood seasons, and with children. After storms she did not believe in perfect answers, believed in small bridges thought mourning the agency. Hall smelled like rain, and metal briefing screens showed the silver shapes coasting over the sea chain of bases had gone to alert first contact teams. Waited for permission, no. One wanted a misstep in the first minute. Test director asked for a volunteer to walk the shoreline and try to make a gentle hello from a human face site. Had to be a single person with no armor and no obvious weapons, and a heart that did not jump at Shadow's glare. Lifted her hand, said she would. Guthers argued that the risk was too great. Their profiles said the alien women carried force inside their voices that could shake a Walloni city, had already reported glass that hummed until it cracked. Claire listened, and then said a quiet thing: fair grows faster in a crowd than it does in one person. Let me go alone, and it will grow slower in the shore. The air smelled of salt, and wet kelplo tide had left a lace of pools across. The black rock sky was the color of a Bruzia craft came down without steam or flame, and it barely kissed the water. A door opened that was not a door, and a figure stepped out with bare feet that did not sink. She was tall and slender, and her veil moved like a second ocean. Her armor seemed alive with slow breathing lie. Their eyes were not a single color. They were bands of river and forest and storm. Claire lifted both hands at her sides in an old sailor sign that meant I carry no knives. Felt fear in her stomach like a knot, but she did not feed itch. Walked until the water tugged at her shoes, and then she stooped. A wave curled around her ankles and drew a clean line between them. Alien woman bowed her head, and the veils trembled as if with breath. Claire said hello in her plain voice. A woman answered with a low tone that made the tide ripple and pushed a thin sheet of spray over the rock. Claire let the wave pass, did not move. Box answered with a hum that matched the pitch. She had hearted. The woman tilted her head. Behind her the craft settled deeper into the water, and the surface went as smooth as polished slate. Second and third figures appeared at the threshold. Did not step down. Watch it, Claire, said her Namish. Chose each word like a small stone placed in a river to shape the flow of water. Me name is Claire. Hope you're safe. One understandy. Will not hurt you. Kept her voice steady in her breath. Slow, the woman answered again this time. The tone was higher, and it went through Claire like a bell. Claire felt the sound touch old places in her chest, where winter had once camped for too long. Showed it in the bones of her hand. She let the sound pass, and then she spoke. The way a cellist would answer another player in a dark room, low, then high, then a gentle slide between. The woman stepped closer, stopped where the wave drew that clean borderline. Her eyes studied the strip of water between. Reached into the tide, and the water rose and wrapped her fingers. The way a small child holds a parent thumb when streets are loud. Claire did not step back, took off her shoes and stepped forward into the cold fur. A breath. Her feet were numb, and then they were awake. She held out her hand and let the tide do the rest. Water lifted and linked their fingertips to watchers at the door. Whispered in a chord that sounded like the thrum of cables in a winter wind. First woman spoke in a string of tones that had space in them like starlight. Claire felt meaning move through sound even. Yet she pointed to her chest and said Claire again. She pointed to the woman with a gentle open hand that asked for a name without taking. Each woman touched her own veil, and then touched the water, and then touched her throat. A name arrived on the air like the rise of a tide pool. Soraya. Claire said the name as softly as she could. Soria, as leaned forward as if they were pulled by a thread. Soraya touched the water again, and it lifted into a small shape like a moon shell. and then loosened. And spilled back, sang 3 notes that bent slowly, as if they were bending light. Claire remembered the miners who taught her to read the tremor and seams by sound, remembered a farmer who taught her to call cows, but too low whistlish. Listened. For the space between notes where Truslivesh answered with that. Spation, the bluff above the shore, cameras waited, and soldiers held their breath, and a world leaned over the rail of its own fear. Claire and Soraya stood with the tide between. And let the small bridge of water be enough, for the first Hort's second hour began. When a wave rose fast with a storm gust, and caught Claire at the knees, and almost took her down the slick rock. Soraya moved in one quick step, and pressed her palm into the water, and it went flat like a held breath. Claire steadied and laughed a little, said thank you with her hands in her eyes, and then found a thread of sound that meant the same thing, because gratitude is older than languages. Soraya answered with a small echo of that thread, and her eyes brightened like a river in sunby. The third hour, the watchers at the door came down to the edge and stood with their veils touching the spraithy kept. A respectful span between. Claire learned that their tones carried more than words, carried weights and promises and shared memory. One Soraya sang a falling note, the others answered with a rising one, as if no voice would leave. Another voice alone in a low placid. Claire showed them how a human palm spreads when the heart opens. Soraya showed her how their fingers cross like a woven reed boat to mean we will carry. This together news reached the hall that another coast had seen glass humming to the point of fracture. Panic rose and feeds, and in streets Claire heard the distant drone of aircraft that were told to stay away, yet circled high like worried birds. She felt fear trying to climb up her spine. Like ice waters told fear to sitch, told fear it could watch without steering thin. She breathed in the sea air, and gave Soraya a small story through tone and sign, told of a winter when the river froze and people walked across to bring hot soup to the far bank, because the bridge had fallen in a flood. Told of strangers who became neighbors because the soup was passed with both hands. Arya listened. And then she told a story too, in tones that were clear enough to paint pictures on a human mind. Told of a world where the ground is full of song, and where you must move with care, because the wrong step can wake a sleeping fault and bring a house down. Told of a war long ago, when voices were used as weapons and plates broke and cities slid into Valish. Told of a vow taken by the daughters of their line that they would never again cut with sound. They came here because our maps show your crust is restless and your coasts are loud. And we thought you might be in danger, and we thought we could help with our old craft. Claire felt tears, but kept them from blurring the line between the watchers on the bluff. Saw the 2 women standing in the tide, and thought the human was captured by a spella. Captain on a distant deck asked for permission to fire a warning shot into open water to make the aliens move back. Director in the hall, said Holt. Director watched. Claire Brethicler understood. The mistake that had seeded Firth humming glass had been a greeting from ships that did not yet know the brittle things we built for light. In comfort tones they used to say hello, had pressed windows until they sang their breaking song. Claire bent and picked a small shard of beach glass that the tide had polished smooth, held it up, and let the gray light pass through. Sang very softly to the shard until it began to tremble between her fingers. Sirius saw it and reached and cupped Claire's hands, and then cupped the shard with careful strength. Tremble went away like a fever breaking. Their eyes met, and there was a wordless laugh between them, as simple as bread. Soraya turned to the watchers and sang a new tone that was gentle as fogged craft door opened wider, and more figures stepped to the sill and listened. And then they tuned the skin of their halts, humming, that had bothered towns along the coast. Fade screens and kitchens and shops reported a drop in the strange vibration. Samin in the hall whispered, bless the steady one snow. The 4th hour began, and with it a test that was no one fault. Lay under the sea, and had been waiting a century for a reason. To movie a tremor rolled through the black rock, and a low roar came. Like a train in a tunnel. Claire saw the horizon lift a little. Soraya and the others felt the deep string twitch. Craft flared with quiet light and settled harder into the water like a hand bracing on a table. Soraya gave a command in 3 tones that made the air feel thicker. Watchers took places at 4 points around the craft. The water began to still in. Ringsclare stood on the rock and listened to the pitch of the earth's felt where it wanted to go.